So we are going to get started now, and it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker to start off this afternoon. And that is Dr. Taka Keegan. He is a computer science senior lecturer at the University of Waikato in New Zealand and an authority on Maori language technologies. He has a background in hardware engineering with research interests in Maori language technologies, Indigenous language interfaces, and multilingual usability. Hopefully he'll break that all down for us. Dr. Keegan has been a driving force behind several important projects involving the Maori language and digital technology. These include assisting Google with the translation of Google Web Search, Google Translate, and other Google technologies into Maori. And then I lost my other sheet. There it is. He's also developed the Microsoft Keyboard, MS Windows, and MS Office in Maori, maintaining the Maori Nupepa, which he explained is a Maori version of newspaper, collection of the New Zealand Digital Library Project, and the translation of Moodle, Te Kete e Purangi, and the Maori Macronizer. So please help me in welcoming Dr. Keegan to the podium.
Tēnā koutou. Tūtai kei te mea atu kia koutou I whakatūwhera hea tō tātou huihinga I ngā tahira. Koutou e tuku ngā inoi ki te rangi, ngā inoi ki te whenua nō reira tēnā koutou. Kei te mea atu ki te haukainga I manakitia Chaki a mate a mātou konei tēnā koutou. Kei te mea atu hoki ki te pai o ngā kōrero, ko kōrero te I nei rā. Kei te mea atu hoki kia koutou katoa ngā mana ngā tapu kua tai mai ki konei. Greetings. So thank you for the opportunity for me to be able to speak in my language. What I was saying was I was thanking the people who opened our conference, thanking the people from this land, and thanking all of the people who have spoken before, and all of the treasures that they bring and that everybody else at the conference brings. Nō reira, tēnā koutou. The topic of my talk is issues with Māori sovereignty over Māori language data, but it occurs to me that this topic is really specific to people in Aotearoa, to Māori people, so most of my talk is going to be more general. So it's going to be general issues with Indigenous language data. Before I get into it, a couple of quick things about myself, just so that you can understand kind of where I'm coming from. So, a quick background. This is the mountain that I was brought up on. I was brought up on the slopes of this mountain, but I was brought up on my father's side, which is non-Indigenous. So koera takutaha Pākehā, and for them that's Mount Egmont. But for my mother's side, that's Maunga Taranaki. I'm not actually from Taranaki, I'm from this mountain here. Doesn't really look it in the picture, but it's actually a much bigger mountain. From our perspective anyway. So that's Maunga Prongia. My family are from this area here, so this is our meeting house. The name of this marae is Pūrekireki. And it's a picture of my mother, my aunties, my uncles, one day when they had a graduation ceremony out there. So that's the marae I'm from. I'm from New Zealand. Of course, it's at the top of the world. It's not near Australia. Australia is near New Zealand. So that's us there at the top of the world. This is the North Island. The area that I'm from is like the centre of the North Island. There's kind of a lighter area in there. E kia ana ko te rū o Waikato, so that's kind of like the Waikato Valley, and that's where I'm from. Māori language, so for those of you who aren't aware, Māori language is the Indigenous language of Aotearoa, New Zealand. Roughly about 1 in 5 people in Aotearoa are Māori, and about 1 in 5 of those people speak Māori language. There has been a lot of good work done in the last 25, 30 years to reclaim, to revitalise our language. but it's still classified as an endangered language. The numbers still suggest that our language is in decline. So we're trying not to be complacent. We're striving hard to revitalise and normalise our language in all of the activities that we do. Okay, so one of those activities involves data or technology, and that's what I want to talk about in the next short time that I have. We think that data is really important. It's really important because this is the age of information, and what drives the age of information is data. So data is used to drive all the major decisions that are happening. If you can control the data, you can literally control the people. So what we want to do is we want to take Indigenous control of data so that Indigenous people can control ourselves. So that's what I want to talk about in the next 30 minutes or so. I've heard it said that data colonisation is the final colonisation. I can't remember who said it, so that's why there's a question mark on this comment. And I'm not really sure if it's true, but that's the significance of data. We can be colonised through data. So we need to be aware of that, and we need to take steps to make sure that we're not colonised through our data. So what I want to do is I want to talk about three major issues. So the first issue is about data protection, and it's data identification and data protection. Then I want to talk about some issues about data sovereignty, how we can reclaim or claim authority over our own data, and then perhaps for me the most important thing I want to talk about is how we can use our data, how we can use our data for our benefit. Okay, is it? Jingos, that's really scary now. Okay, data protection, data sovereignty, the usage of our data. So those are the things I want to talk about. So let's have a look at the first one. Indigenous data protection. So this is about how, as Indigenous people, we protect our own data. To be able to protect our own data, the first thing we need to do is identify it. Where is our data located? What's there? And I think there's three areas where we need to look. The first area is our traditional knowledge. Where is our traditional knowledge located? Where is it stored? Is it in manuscripts? Is it on tapes? Is it in people's minds? So once we've identified where it's stored, then we need to do some other things. So traditional knowledge is the first thing. The second thing is Indigenous language data. So where is all the data stored about our language, the recordings of our language? And again, is it in manuscripts? Is it on tapes? Is it in people's minds? The third area that we need to identify is new data. So anybody that captures data about Indigenous people, I think that's Indigenous data. I think we should have control over that data. So if the government or whoever has statistics about how we do in education, how we're doing financially, criminal records, I think we should take ownership. If it's data about us, it's our data, we need to take ownership of that. So there's three areas we need to look at when we're identifying our data. Once we've identified our data, then the next step is to protect it. We need to protect it so that we don't lose it. We need to protect it so that we can use it now and protect it so that we can use it in the future. And there's kind of two types of protection. There's the physical protection and then there's legal protection. So the physical protection is like digitizing it if it's not digitizing it, copying it, making backups, placing it in secure places. Redundancy is the term used to make sure that we don't lose it in the future. The legal protection is copyright and intellectual property rights. And copyright is a term that doesn't work for Indigenous data because, especially traditional data we keep it kind of forever. But with the term copyright, after a certain time, the rights cease and then it's available to anybody. So that doesn't work for our data. So we need to think of ways of protecting our data from a legal perspective that suits Indigenous people. There's a group at home that have produced a model, the beginnings of a model called Kaitiakitanga. So they have written a protection document that they're going to start using for some of the software that they've created. And we'll have a quick look at that in a second. So identify our data, protect our data, and then what we want to do is protect the data in a way that it's available to the correct people. Not all of our data should be available to all of us. Some people might argue with that. But when we're protecting it, let's see if we can protect it so the right type of data is available to the right type of people. Because ultimately, if our knowledge is not available to be used, then what's the point of our knowledge? Okay, so step number 1, data protection, data identification, data protection. This is a site. Somebody emailed me about this a couple of weeks ago. I jumped on and have a quick look. I don't know if there's anybody here from this First Nations data centre. I had a look at what they were doing. It looks like they're protecting Indigenous data in an Indigenous format by Indigenous people for Indigenous people. I need to get in touch with these guys. I think this could be a good model. We need to create some data centres in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and maybe there's a model here that we can use. So a shout out, I raise my hands to the First Nations Data Centre. Okay, Indigenous data protection, Indigenous data sovereignty. So not only must we protect our data, we must have autonomy over our data. So to do that, we need to discuss ownership. We need to take ownership of our data. And the ownership should be an ownership from an Indigenous perspective, not the ownership from a non-Indigenous legal perspective. Because when it's an ownership from an Indigenous perspective, it's an ownership that is inherited down. Okay, so we need to be aware of that, and then what I think we should start doing is chasing up this new data that's been collected about Indigenous people, and how do we get ownership of that data? Somebody's holding data about me, I think that should be mine. So there's a question of ownership, there is a question of how the information has been collected. Because if the information hasn't been collected in an Indigenous way, then maybe that's not the same use to us. So we need to think about how we're collecting or how the information has been collected. And if we're starting to collect our own information, let's try and collect it from an Indigenous perspective. If we're collecting it from an Indigenous perspective, then how can we model it? How can we shape it? How can we frame it so it makes sense to us? And as Indigenous people, we are the ones that have that say. There's a group of librarians who I think have got quite a good example, which I'll have a quick look at in a second, where we can start doing that. How's the data identified? Another piece of research that's happening about to happen at home is this thing called the use of algorithms to make decisions. And from an Indigenous perspective, we want to decolonise the algorithms. Okay, we think there's a bias in the algorithms, so we want to decolonise them. But from a computer science perspective, it's not about colonised or non-colonised, it's about discriminatory or non-discriminatory. So I don't care whatever term we use, we need to have a look at the algorithms that are making decisions about our data and check that they're making decisions from an Indigenous perspective. So that's a bit of research that we're going to look at over the next couple of years. Okay, so identifying, framing our data. So this example here, so this is an example of a license created by a group of people up north at a radio station initially called Te Hiku Media, and this is called their Kaitiaki license. So this is a way that they've decided to release the code that they've created on natural language processing software in a way that's comfortable to them. So the license basically has three things that it says. It says if you want to use this code, you must ask for our permission. If you want to generate any money from this code, again, you must ask our permission. And you're probably not going to get it. And then the third thing, if you want to derive or build any other code based on this code, again, you must ask our permission. So this is an example of how, as Indigenous people, we can start creating copyright laws on our own software, on our own resources. This is an example here of how we can start to begin to define our data. So the Māori subject headings is an initiative that was created by the library, some libraries in New Zealand. 3 primary library groups in New Zealand got together and they decided that the way that books were stored in the library didn't make sense to a Māori's perspective. So you used a Dewey system, it made sense to a non-Māori perspective, but it didn't make sense to a Māori perspective. So they got together and they said, if we were going to design a whole new way of categorising all of our subjects, how would we do it? And they came up with this model. The model's got 3 parts. It's got a wairua part, a tinana part, a hinengaro part. So a spiritual part, a physical part, and kind of like an emotion or thinking part. So based on those 3 parts, we redefined how information should be stored in the library. And I think that's a good model that we could take and redefine how we store our data, how we capture our data and place it in a database from an Indigenous perspective. Okay, we identify our data, we protect our data, we have sovereignty over our data. Let's start to use it. So my thinking is Indigenous data's use should be for the benefit of Indigenous people. If it's not for the benefit of the Indigenous people, then it shouldn't be used. Indigenous data, Indigenous people shouldn't have to pay for their Indigenous data. It kind of makes sense, but there's lots of examples when we are having to pay for our data, and we should put a stop to that. No more of that. If there's any profit, any monetising that's happening on Indigenous people's data, then that profit, that money, should go back to Indigenous people. These are the things we should be quite strong on, I believe. If we have knowledge and we don't use it, it's wasted, so let's define our data, let's use our data to our benefit, basically. Okay, so what I want to do now is I want to look at 3 specific data types, or 3 specific data environments. They're specifically about language data, because that's where I spend most of my time working with the language technologies, and they're specific to the Māori language. Before I do that, I just want to digress a little bit. So I've heard this a lot over the conference, especially in the morning talks. A lot of the talks have said that things are different in our language. The way we look at things is different, the way we feel is different. Our humour is different in our language. So what I'd like to do now is just show some humour from the Māori language. So it's specific to the Māori language, but I'm going to see if I can get it across. So we have this group, a Facebook group called Te Reo Māori Memes. So memes that are in Te Reo Māori. And they're quite strict. If you post a meme in here and it's not in Māori, then they tell you to take it down. So here's a couple of memes. So I want to share a couple of memes just to highlight why language is important to us. So here's the first one. And let me explain what it says in Māori. So there's a question going to the pilot of this aircraft. And the question says, I tūtaku koe ki te iwi taketake o te motu rā. Did you meet the Indigenous people of that island? Did you meet the Indigenous people of that island? And the pilot's response was, Kao engari I tuku kararehe mai rātou. No, but I did receive a message from them. So it kind of works in English. I think it actually works a lot better in Te Reo Māori. So that's the first one. The second one I could share lots, but time is running out. So the second one is, so there's a popular phrase in Te Reo Māori that associates people with the land. So if I'm from the river, if I'm a river-based tribe, then I would say, ko au te awa, ko te awa au. I am one with the river is one with me. If I'm from the ocean, ko au te moana, ko te moana au. I am one with the ocean is one with me. From the forest, ko au te ngāhiri, ko te ngāhiri au. So here we have a white cat standing beside a white wall saying, ko au te pakitara, ko te pakitara au. I want to be as one with the wall, so these two dogs chasing me will not find me. So, if you're Māori, you can understand Reo Māori, you instantly know what that means. Okay? And that's why I want to say it's different in our languages. Our languages are important. They can convey a much wider breadth of emotion. If I get back to those examples, I just want to take a quick divergence again and talk about this guy, the language activist. So these two slides are taken from a presentation I gave in Hawaii early in the year. And it's really just, it's a raising up, I guess, of all the people that are working for their language. I've heard a bunch of phrases today, language proponents, language supporters, language warriors. The phrase I like to use is a language activist. And for me, a language activist is somebody who's actively doing some work for their language. So if you actively do some work to promote your language, in my mind, you're a language activist. Aokoe iti he pounamu. It may only be small, but it's a treasure. Language activists do things for the right reasons, do their work for the language for the right reasons. They don't do it for money, because there's not much money in it. They don't do it for acknowledgement. They don't do it to become famous. They do it because they have a love for their language and they want to support their language. And they do it to help others. By doing this kind of work, you can create relationships with sister languages. You can get ideas, enthusiasm, encouragement from others. So that's what a language activist is all about. And like I said, I want to lift up, there's a phrase I've just learned the last couple of days, lift up all the language activists in the room. But there's one other. There's what I term a hardcore language activist. Okay? So that's a language activist that does a little bit more. Okay? Doesn't necessarily have to be illegal. It could be legal things like going on marches or petitioning Parliament, semi-legal things like chopping down trees or chopping down flagpoles, painting buildings. I heard this morning graffitiing buildings. I've heard of people being banned from countries. I've heard of people that have burnt cars down and a few other things like that. So it could be legal things, could be the other things, but hardcore language activist is someone that wants to take a little step further into the support of language activism. You will find that hardcore language activists are quite selfish because their focus is only on their language. So they don't spend too much time with other activities, sports or anything else. Their focus is on their language. And quite often it's only on their language, not on other languages. So they're selfish in their focus, but within their own language, they're very generous. And a hardcore language activist will help you out if you're working with your language. As I said earlier, very poor, but they're rich, not financially rich, but rich in the treasures that language provides. And I'm sure everybody here knows what that's about. Hardcore language activists quite often face doom and gloom, but there's always hope. Because if there wasn't hope, I guess they wouldn't be doing it. Hardcore language activists are fiercely passionate about their language. Behind every successful project I've ever seen, there is a hardcore language activist, and possibly more than one. So, hands up, I raise up to all the hardcore language activists in the room, in the conference, around the world that are working to support their language. Tēnā koutou. Okay, back to the topic. Indigenous language usage. We must use our Indigenous language data for the benefit of our people. Okay, there's 3 examples. Example number 1, Google Translate. So this is myself and my lovely wife. We went and about 10 years ago, stayed at Google, stayed at the place where Google is. I worked for them for 6 months. We worked on this tool here, Google Translate. Actually, we didn't work on that tool. We worked on another tool, the Google Translator Toolkit, but after that tool, Google Translate came out. So basically, an automatic translation service. It uses machine training technology. It uses statistical analysis to produce translations. When we left, so this is a picture from when we left. When we left, it wasn't working too bad in certain genres. I wouldn't say it was perfect all across, and that really wasn't the intention, but it wasn't working too bad in all the genres. But now, it's certainly, so this is a shot taken recently, a couple of weeks ago, and the language has changed. The translation has changed. So if we go back, so the original phrase in Māori, tēnei au ka mihi atu kia koutou katoa, and today I greet you all, that's how it would translate it 4 or 5 years ago. If you look at it today, tēnei au ka mihi atu kia koutou katoa, the same phrase would be translated as, I would like to thank you all. So the translation has changed. Most of the time, I think, not for the better. We haven't had any input into that change. The way the system is set up, it automatically gathers data, automatically makes the change. We have no control over what it's spitting out. As Māori language activists, we have no control what Google Translate is doing. And I don't think that's a good thing. I think that's something we need to be aware of and watch out for. When I worked there, great bunch of people, really friendly people, have really good intentions, but to be honest, no one in Google really cared about Māori language. The people that care about Māori language are the people that speak Māori language. So I applaud them for all of their goodwill, but if we want to create technologies for our own language, we have to do it ourselves. Okay, so that's example number 1. Example number 2 is the Microsoft Translator Hub. Over the last 10 years or so, I've worked with Microsoft to build a couple of products that have helped our language. This is one of them here. So this is the translation of Microsoft Office and Microsoft Windows into Te Reo Māori. So if you have a look along the top, where it's supposed to say file is the word kōnai. If you go down the menu, hau means new, tuwhera means open, kati means close. So the whole of the interface in our language. And the thinking behind that was so that our children could go to school, start using a computer, log on, do some work, do some research, maybe type some things out, log off, never have to switch out of the Māori language. And it kind of worked. The issue was that none of the teachers in the schools really understood the words that were being used, so they couldn't use it. So it hasn't really ko'u ki te kaupapa as much as I would have liked. It hasn't really spread as much as it should have. And so those are some of the things that I think we need to work on. So Microsoft have their own version of Google Translate. So the Microsoft version is called the Translator Hub. So this is the Translator Hub here. And what it is basically is you feed it with some data and then it automatically creates translations based on your data. This example is different to the Google example because this example puts a lot of work in the community's hands. So you're responsible for the data that goes in there. You're responsible for the checking and the verifying. So I think this is a much better way than Google, though the issue with this is basically it's a large international company coming to a Māori organisation or a community organisation, a language organisation, and saying, we have this tool, we think it would be good for you to use it. Which is kind of okay, but I think it's much better for the community organisation to stand up and say, we need this tool, and to turn around to the large international corporation. And that's, or even better, build itself. And that brings me quite neatly to example number 3. So now, example number 3 is a group up in the Taitukara, up in the north of the North Island. It's a group that's initially from a radio station. It's called Te Hiku Media, is the overall group from the Te Hiku radio station. This is the guys. There's 2 guys in particular. The guy in the front with the blue sunglasses on, his name is Peter Lucas Jones. And then the guy on the back leaning on the fence doing the Hawaiian sign. So his name is Keone. He's actually Hawaiian, so he's allowed to do that sign. But those 2 guys in particular have worked on some natural language processing tools. So the processing tools they wanted, they decided one day that they had a whole lot of language data. So a whole lot of recordings, mostly audio, some video stored with valuable information. And they had like heaps of it. Peter says to me, it's the biggest recording of Māori language data in the country, and I believe that's true. So what they were thinking, what they were wanting to do was, how can we make this information back to our people? And, how can we make it, how can we share it, how can we make it usable? And so what they decided to do was, we have to go through and transcribe it. We have to transcribe everything that's been said so that it can be searched, so that it can come alive. That takes transcription. Anybody who's worked with transcription knows that takes a long time. They started doing it and they thought to themselves, this is going to take forever, hundreds of years. Let's get a computer to do it. So they built a tool that could listen to Māori language and convert it to text. Speech to text. They built a tool called a speech to text tool. So this is the website where they're releasing a lot of their tools. And on the bottom right, there's a speak demo. So if you speak into that tool in Te Reo Māori, it will attempt to write your Māori language speech in text. And it's pretty good. 6 months ago, they were working at a 14% error rate. Now they're down to a 10% error rate. So that's one of the tools they've built. They've built another tool that if you hit it with a really long piece of audio, it will segment the audio out so it can work at sections of the audio individually rather than having to process the whole file. So they've got a segmentation tool. And then they've started building a tool that can speak Māori language from written text. They showed a demo of it to me a couple of weeks ago. And it's in the beginnings. It's clearly Māori language that's being spoken. So it's quite a good example. I don't really want to bring up and show these tools because it's not my right. Maybe further down the track we'll get these boys out here to show these tools working. But what I wanted to do is show the example. So this is a Māori organisation having a Māori need, standing up themselves, and building some tools to use Māori information, Māori language information. And I think that's an example we should strive to follow. Okay, example 1, example 2, example 3, time is ticking down. Language data importance. So, I think it's crucial that we look after our language data. In the age of information, language data is the driver for all future language intelligence. That's a bold thing to say. Currently, we can use technology in English quite readily. We can pull out our phones, we can ask our phones, what's the weather? We can ask our phones, what are the directions to get to the airport? Ultimately, we should be able to ask our phones in our Indigenous language simple questions but then even more deeper questions. Imagine if you could ask the phone in your Indigenous language, what is the meaning of a certain word, or what is the meaning of a place, and have your phone respond not from an English or a colonized perspective, but have it respond in a perspective from your language, from your culture, from your world viewpoint. I don't think that's impossible. I don't think it will happen for some of our languages in the immediate future, but I believe it will happen eventually. So, to do that, to make that happen, we must protect our data, we must protect our language data. Indigenous people must control our Indigenous language data. I think I'm repeating myself here. Okay, so 3 issues: data protection, data sovereignty, data use. Okay, how could we do it? How could each one of us here think about how we could make some of this technology working for our language? I don't have too many ideas because it will be different for each different situation. But what I'd like to do is kind of instill in you the possibility that it could happen, and some of the things you should do in the beginnings to make it happen in the future. Because let's make that happen. So, one of the things you need to do is get language community support. It's no good one person standing up on their own saying they can do all of this thing. And I think that kind of works with a lot of our language initiatives. One person can't do it all, but as a community we can do great things. So if we want to make technology happen for our language, we've got to get support of our community. Often this can include spiritual support. So as an Indigenous people, we're quite spiritual. We were eating lunch about half an hour ago and everybody had to stop to do the correct karakia, and then we could carry on. So we are spiritual people. If we tap into that, it will help our language technology. Have you ever tried to start your car and it couldn't start? And so then we start calling out to our spirits to start our car. I think I come from a hardware perspective. I know how computers are built, kind of what makes them tick. I still think there's an element to get spiritual support in our technology. Language community, spiritual support. I think it's really important that the initiatives we create, especially in technology, aren't initiatives that, we have a saying, he harore rangi tahi noiho, a one-day mushroom. So we don't want to create initiatives that are going to like flame up and then die out. We have to think about initiatives, technology initiatives that will allow new technologies to be built on top of them and have a long-term sustainability. So that's to all the technical people out there. When you're building technical stuff, what do we need to think about to make sure this will be around for the next version of the iPhones or for the next version of Android or whatever. Tahi roa toru. As with anything we do with endangered languages, expect many obstacles along the way. If it's easy, anybody could do it. Some of the things we're doing are incredibly difficult. Those guys from Te Hiku Media, they came and see me about 3 years ago, and they says, we want to create speech-to-text technology. And I was going, okay, that's really difficult. They came back to me 2 years later, we've done it. So expect obstacles, but don't let them prevent you. Find ways around them. Indigenous people are innovative people. Indigenous people are clever. We can find ways around those obstacles. And then the final point, which again comes from those boys who created their technology, they said to our group they were talking to, we need to be true to our tupuna, but we don't need to be slaves to them. And the thinking along those lines was we need to listen to the guidance from our elders, but we shouldn't be held back from it. Because if we were held back, then we'd end up doing nothing. So take the guidance from our elders and then merge forward. That's what we should be doing. So, if we want to make language technology work for our languages, here's a couple of words of advice I can offer, but ultimately, you've just got to go out and do it. Okay, kupu whakamutinga. So, final point. So we have the saying, well actually, I just made up this saying. We now have the saying. I had to talk to one of my language specialists early this morning and we came up with the saying, and it goes like this: Mā te Māori anō ana raunga e angatu ai e Māori ake ai. So Indigenous data will be most effective if it's created by Indigenous people in an Indigenous way. And there's a little bit of a stretch on that. There's a little bit of a step further, and it says, because I'm working with language, mā te Māori anō ana raunga reo e angatu ai e Māori ake ai. So Indigenous language data, not just Indigenous data, but Indigenous language data will be most effective if created by Indigenous people in an Indigenous way. And one slight twist on it, because we're here in Canada, First People language data will be most effective if created by First People in a First People way. Nō reira, koe tāku kia koutou katoa, me te mihi kau atu ana, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou. Thank you, everybody.